Hi, everyone. We have a couple of seconds so that we can let everyone file in. Today is the last webinar of our series, so I'm so excited to welcome you back. Um, for those of you who haven't been here before, welcome. And for those of you who are joining us for this third and final webinar of the series after joining our other two, welcome back. My name is Rachel So. I'm the Senior Specialist of Digital Marketing and Communications here at CEREC. And on behalf of the CEREC team, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. So it's been about 4 months since our previous webinar and our last time that we connected. So hopefully everyone had a great summer. This is the last webinar of the series, Navigating Canada's Evolving Labor Market for LMIC experts sharing insights, challenges, and opportunities. Well, we've had it sponsored by the Labor Market Information of Canada. So for this last session, we're pleased to welcome back LMIC's very own Ken Chatur, who will be with us to delve into the implications of Canada's aging workforce, identifying high risk occupations and regions using tools like the replacement ratio. But before starting, I'd like to pay respect to the original peoples of the territory upon which I'm physically sitting in Toronto. I'm acknowledging that for thousands of years, these lands and waters were cared for by the people of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga Anishinaabe of the New Credits. And since we're so close to National Truth and Reconciliation Day, which takes place tomorrow, we are seeing this land acknowledgement as just another reminder of an opportunity for us collectively to continue learning and working towards that reconciliation. So, by doing that, today we are going to encourage you to collectively learn with us. We are sharing a resource that connects Indigenous worldviews to career development. So, in the chat, Iman will share a brand new article from CareerWise. It shares a list of 11 resources, and these resources will enable career service professionals to better understand, support, and honor the lived experience of Indigenous peoples. It also recognizes the historical and systemic factors that shape education and employment. So please check that out. Aman will send a link to that article in the chat. And as usual, we have some brief housekeeping notes. So as for this session and like our last couple of sessions, you can use the Zoom chat or Q&A to interact with our presenter and with the audience. We'll also be using Menti, I believe, on the LMIC team, and they'll give you some instructions on that. So if you want to be involved with that, Gabrielle will help share some information there. You'll also receive the recording and a copy of the slides by email in the coming days. And to access AI generated subtitles and closed captions, you can click the CC button located on the bottom of your Zoom window and select the Show Subtitle button to view those subtitles in real time. So, I would like to introduce to you our knowledgeable and fantastic returning presenter for LMIC, Ken Chatur. He is the Director of Research and Strategic Foresight at LMIC. He brings a wealth of expertise in education, labor market equity, with a proven track record of driving evidence based policymaking. He has played a key role in shaping impactful initiatives, contributing to government evaluations and research on critical issues such as mental health, funding structures in public services, work integrated learning, and the labor market transition for new graduates. So we're so delighted to have him with us once again today, and I would love to pass over the mic to Ken.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. Uh, oh, can everyone hear me?
Yep, all good.
Okay, great. So I'm Ken Tretier, the Director of Research and Strategic Foresight at the Labor Market Information Council. We want to make sure you're all engaged today. So just a heads up, we are using a tool called Mentimeter to engage with you throughout our presentation. In the meantime, feel free to share your role and where you're joining us from today. Next slide, please. So, originally launched in 2017, LMIC exists to address current and long-standing challenges in Canada's often fragmented and siloed labor market information system. We work at the intersection of the federal government and Canada's 13 provinces and territories. We also work with the Forum of Labor Market Ministers, or the FLMM, to identify and work on labor market information issues. The goal of our work is to help identify and address gaps in timelines, accessibility, and consistency in labor market information. We also aim to foster collaboration across the pan-Canadian landscape. By doing so, we can advance better labor market information to empower Canadians to make better decisions about the world of work and workforce planning. Now, as I'm sure you all know, Canada's labor market information ecosystem is dynamic and changing, especially right now. We have contributions coming from a wide range of sources, from government, research agencies, and increasingly private firms. You should think of LMIC as a knowledge broker in our ecosystem. We connect the different parts of our ecosystem to address and prioritize challenges. We also try to not reinvent the wheel. Our work is meant to complement the robust research produced by organizations like Statistics Canada and other academic researchers, and to make sure the information we share is practical and accessible for all Canadians. So, before I go any further, I should clarify what we mean by labor market information. At the highest level, labor market information, or LMI, is anything that provides timely, relevant, and accurate information about the labor market, and it helps you to make important decisions related to the labor market you live in. This can manifest in a few ways. So, LMI can be based on numbers, so things like statistics like employment, unemployment, wages, salaries, etc. It can also be future-looking things like occupational projections and future employment forecasts. But LMI can also be the information that Canadians use to make informed decisions about their careers through things like informal networks, family, friends, or qualitative information. So, on to our topic for today, mature workers in Canada's labor market, and how we can use LMI to anticipate the impacts of an aging population. And for reference, when we use the term mature workers, we are referring to currently employed workers over the age of 55. This is based off of work by LMIC's former senior economist, Laura Adkins Hackett, who is now a chief economist in the government of Alberta, and former LMIC research lead, Anne-Laure Franken. This work was published just over a year ago, but as you'll see, it still remains and will continue to be quite relevant. Now, before we get into specifics, let's zoom out a bit and take a look at the big picture. Canada's workforce is aging, and the number of Canadians approaching retirement has never been higher. Consider this. In 2000, just 12.6% of Canadians in the workforce were over the age of 55. In 2023, that number was 21.6%. But how do we know that this is happening for sure? After all, I just explained one age cohort. Let's take a look at different age groups and how their share of the population has aged over a 20-year period. On the y-axis is the share of workers in each age group, which are on the x-axis. The light orange diamonds are where things were in 2003, and the dark orange circles are closer to where things are now. Immediately, you can see the most significant change has happened with the over 55 cohort, while all other younger age cohorts have either witnessed a decline or little change. This is the crux of how the population is aging and the way that it is. But why is this happening? In a nutshell, the balance of forces shaping our country's demographics are tilted towards an aging population. Let's take a look at some of the forces, and this is not an exclusive list. You're free to share in the chat some other forces worth mentioning that aren't covered here. So let's start off with the forces tilting towards an aging population. First, the baby boomer population are a disproportionate size compared to other age cohorts. That makes their aging out of the workforce unusually pronounced in its effect just because of sheer numbers. Secondly, the retirement age of Canadians has slowly been increasing. Some of this is due to policies around retirement, but some of it also has to do with an economic reality that requires some individuals to work longer than traditional retirement in the past. Related to this fact is that in addition to an increasing lifespan, our health span, which describes years of good health, are longer than ever. This means people can choose to work longer if they want because they have the health capacity to do so. Thirdly, like almost every country in the world, fertility rates are declining, and this is in part due to multiple factors. Many are starting families later. Economic and cost of living can impact family planning decisions. And there are other complex social factors that we won't get into today for time. Finally, Canadians are starting to work later than they used to. This is in part due to a dramatic increase in the rates of tertiary education, so think college and university. This type of education takes longer for participants to enter the labor market. This hasn't necessarily translated to Canadians working less to retire, but rather still working a similar length to retirement, but with a later start. But what about the youthful forces? One of the most significant contributions to Canada's workforce over the past century has been the rise of women in the workforce. This has had a positive effect in slowing the rapid aging of the overall workforce and increasing the size of the workforce. Secondly, immigration has also helped to slow the aging of the workforce. This is simply because immigrants who arrive in Canada tend to be younger than the average working age Canadian. We're going to revisit some of these factors a bit later on today. So why should you care? So you've seen that this is very much happening, and there are lots of complicating reasons why. How is this going to affect you? Well, the direct impact is actually quite straightforward. As a historically large proportion of the population gears for retirement out of the workforce, the number of available workers decreases, which can create or worsen labor skills and shortages. The indirect impact on labor demand will be from an altered economic consumption pattern as this larger segment of the population grows older. About those changing consumption patterns, public expenditures for health and social security are increasing with the aging population, just as our economy is facing a potential reduction in the tax base to fund these very expenditures. This is going to be especially true if there is an insufficient inflow of new entrants into the labor market. Now, I'm going to pause here for just a second because I'm realizing we're painting a somewhat dire picture. And I do want to emphasize that none of this is a certainty. Some have argued that this future is not set in stone. Unexpected innovations in tech, innovative policy, and other opportunities we can't yet foresee could make this more of a sector-specific phenomenon rather than a widespread crisis. In fact, some research have made a point to take a proactive approach to this new reality. Crucial to this, in order to mitigate effectively, it's important to have an early indicator of trends. And some of this research, by the way, was done more than 20 years ago, just highlighting how long people have identified that this is something we need to think about. Now, this is where the importance of good LMI to identify trends matters a lot. You could argue that this should, in fact, be the first step, which is kind of what we're doing today. Next slide, please. So, why does this matter to CDP specifically, who I know make up a big part of this audience today? CDPs are at the front lines of supporting Canadians' career ambitions and lifelong journeys. Part of mitigation and careful planning is anticipating and preparing for change. And as the work-seeking population changes, so will the clientele of CDPs and the way you have to approach supporting them. Using LMI effectively can allow you to find innovative ways to understand the impact of an aging population and will better prepare CDPs as they navigate Canada's changing demographics. Okay. We've talked a lot about the context, but what about the metric that we can use to understand all of this? So the labor market metric that LMIC researchers focused on was the age replacement ratio. The age replacement ratio compares the number of employed workers in the 15 to 54 age cohort compared to those at or over 55. LMIC recommends using Statistics Canada's Labor Force Survey to conduct these calculations, since it's updated relatively frequently and provides the most up-to-date, trustworthy, and reliable information on Canadian workers. We also need to use the LFS because we need to use the number of employed workers, not just the general population numbers. Now, the calculation itself is pretty simple. We divide the number of employed workers from the age of 15 to 54 by the number of employed workers over 55. So now that you know what it is and how it's calculated, what does it mean? The age replacement ratio gives us a sense of the dependency on mature workers. For example, if your ratio is 4, that means mature workers make up 20% of the workforce. Or more intuitively, a ratio of 4 means that for every mature worker, there are 4 workers under the age of 55. Okay, so how can we interpret and use this in a policy or labor market context? A lower replacement ratio means there is a high dependence on mature workers which means there is a greater risk of labor and skill shortages as mature workers retire out of the market. A higher dependence on mature workers also tells us there may be an insufficient flow of young or new workers into a specific occupation, or an issue with attrition in an occupation. Okay, so let's take a quick pause before we get into the data, and we're going to engage with Mentimeter, which I mentioned earlier. So you'll see in the chat, we have a link that you can use to go to Mentimeter. You can also use the QR code that you see on your screen to do it on your phone if that's easier. Um, so the question we're asking is just a quick check. A high replacement ratio means, so let's see some answers going in. Okay, so a high age replacement ratio means that there are more young workers for every older individual. That actually means that there is a lower risk of shortages because there are many younger workers to replace retirees. So I could see, based on this response rate, that this can be a somewhat unintuitive concept. So the best way I would let you think about it is think of it as an inverse. The higher the replacement ratio, uh, the lower the risk for the labor market. The lower the replacement ratio, that means that there are less young people to replace the retiring workforce. So if you think about risk and the replacement ratio as an inverse, that will help you conceptualize it. And I'll be reinforcing this throughout the presentation. So don't worry if it seems a little confusing right now. Next question that we have is around why is the age replacement ratio a useful metric for future planning? Why would we want to use this? Is it because it might give us a signal of potential labor and skill shortages? Is it because it's signaling an insufficient flow of new workers? Why do we want to look at any of this in the first place? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of you are getting it. Yep, all of the above. The replacement ratio is very useful because it gives us a signal through the noise of everything that's happening in the labor market. It can warn us that there may be an insufficient flow of new workers, or that people may be dropping out of occupations, or it can signal that low availability to fill existing vacancies. Okay, great. Let's move back to the presentation. So the reason I went through that just now is because context really matters for interpretation. And now that we're all on the same page, let's talk about when it is and isn't appropriate to use the age replacement ratio and some things you need to keep in mind for your own work. First, the relative size of an occupation is going to impact its ability to recover from significant retirements. Think about it this way. It's usually easier and less expensive to address a shortage of 500 workers compared to 5,000 or 50,000. But there's another issue besides just numbers. When can we actually say a ratio is too lopsided and warrants some kind of intervention? Well, for interpretability, programming, and policy purposes, it is very useful to have a threshold. In their research, Laura and Anne-Laure set two conditions to determine a risk threshold. First, they determined that the replacement ratio should be below 3.6. This number also happens to be the national average. Secondly, the high-level occupation should represent 10% of the total employment in the region of interest. A quick caveat to this. These conditions are just if we're doing a high-level risk assessment. There are lots of occupations, especially when you go into more specific ones where the population threshold will be less relevant. Think of a specialized type of glazier for commercial and environmentally friendly skyscrapers. We wouldn't expect them to be 10% of the occupations in any region, but that doesn't mean the age replacement ratio can be a real issue with real implications, especially in a region where, say, there's a lot of construction happening and you need that occupation to get a project done. So the set of rules we're sharing right now are what you'd use if you're starting at a very high level. So why are we going through all of this work? Again, the departure of experienced workers can create institutional and organizational knowledge gaps. That requires us to have proactive strategies to transfer knowledge to younger workers for a smooth transition. Secondly, proactively preparing for an age-diverse workforce will help foster innovation and resilience. And being proactive can help ease the impact of retirement on skills or labor shortages. And finally, by looking at the whole range of workers, the ratio is a useful indicator of the health of the labor market and the extent that it can recover from an influx of retirements. Okay, I have teased everyone on this call long enough, so let's get to the data and what it tells us about what's happening in Canada. So first, the national replacement ratio has been declining consistently for the last 20 years. That means the workforce is getting older. Put another way, between 2000 and 2023, the actual number of workers under the age of 55 has increased by 20%. Not bad, right? Except that the number of mature workers has increased by a whopping 184%, or nearly tripled. This, as I acknowledged earlier, is being driven by the historically large size of the baby boomer population and the increase in average retirement age. So the figure you're looking at here is very simple, but it shows you just how dramatic the shift in our workforce has been. In 2000, there are about 8 workers for every mature worker. 10 years later, it was about 5. Today, that number has dropped to a bit less than 4. The trend line is profound and clear. The population is aging. So right now, the national age replacement ratio is 3.6. This is useful to understand what's happening at a very high level. But as I'm sure all of you know, as I can see representation from all over the country today, Canada is very large and a very regionalized country. So we need to look at the age replacement ratio in each jurisdiction in the country. And again, remember, the lower the ratio, the older the workforce, the greater the risk. In general, we see that Atlantic Canada is the region of Canada with the lowest age replacement ratio, with Newfoundland and Labrador having the lowest ratio at 3.2. This means they have the highest risk of impacts from an aging workforce. Ontario is right at the national average at 3.6. Not a huge surprise, given it represents 40% of the population, but this may be a place where you might want to look and see the differences between, say, the GTA, Southwestern Ontario, Northern Ontario. Again, going into geography can matter a lot. Western and Northern Canada have higher age replacement ratios for the most part, with Yukon being an exception. Digging in further, Alberta, Manitoba, and by far Nunavut have significantly higher age replacement ratios than the rest of the country. This means they have the youngest workforces in Canada and have the least risk of impacts from the aging workforce. Now, there are many reasons why these differences exist, from cultural to economic and patterns of interprovincial migration for those seeking work. This provides questions that policymakers can and should dive deeper into. But understanding jurisdictional differences, it can give us a sense of which regions are most at risk, but it is not enough to just look at regions. We also have to look at specific occupational sectors. And here, because we're still at a high level, we're going to be using those 2 rules around population and a ratio lower than 3.6. We're not going to go down to the 5-digit knock level since that's not the goal of our talk today. That's something you can do depending on your context if you want to dive deeper into this. We're going to show you the high-level occupation ratios. So what does this look like? Here you can see that the age replacement ratio is quite variable. There are some bright spots, especially in arts and recreation and natural and applied sciences. We've certainly seen a push towards STEM education over the past few decades, so it's not a huge surprise to see the younger cohort in these occupations. And education and health also have a relatively higher age replacement ratio. Both of these are robust sectors in Canada, so it's not surprising to see them have a somewhat higher than average age replacement ratio. Where we witness particularly low ratios are in management, manufacturing, trades, and transportation. So let's focus a bit on these at-risk occupations. The skilled trades, especially in transportation, manufacturing, and utilities, have low replacement ratios, meaning they have a disproportionately older workforce. This is not terribly surprising. We have seen a shift in educational patterns across Canada for the past half century, towards university credentials like bachelor's and postgraduate programs like master's and PhDs, which reflects the growth of the knowledge economy over the past half century. Business and finance also see lower age replacement ratios, but by far the lowest are for management occupations, especially legislative and senior management occupations. Unlike the other occupations here, the reasons here are pretty intuitive. People who end up in management and senior positions generally tend to do so later on in their career, so we would expect those occupations to be older. So it would be too chaotic to show you the numbers for each occupational group in each jurisdiction. So what you're looking at here is a summarized table of which occupations met that at-risk threshold and in which province. And so we looked at that for a few different occupations. And here you can see why starting to do that more granular analyses I alluded to earlier by both jurisdiction and occupation is really important. For example, trades and transportation are at risk in 9 out of Canada's 13 provinces and territories, indicating that this is a broader national problem. Business and finance also appear in about half of all jurisdictions. On the flip side, we see education and government services and management meet the at-risk threshold, but only in one jurisdiction each, meaning that they are regional challenges. This matters a lot when we think about the policies and strategies that we might need to employ and who needs to be involved for addressing this challenge. We want to create efficient and targeted strategies, so mapping out the at-risk occupations in this manner can help us do that. So we can't just do this presentation without acknowledging the fact that this isn't happening in a vacuum. So we're going to talk a little bit about some other factors to keep in mind. And remember, this is not an exhaustive list. So let's talk about immigration, which has been a significant buffer in slowing the rate of Canada's overall aging workforce. Between 2016 and 2021, Canada welcomed about 1.3 million immigrants. So this is an important factor in all of this. About two-thirds of immigrants were born between the ages of 25 and 34, and recent immigrants have a higher labor participation rate than non-immigrants, about 78% for immigrants compared to 65% for non-immigrants. This highlights immigration as one way to manage the risks of an aging workforce, as it provides access to a younger population. But nothing is really ever that simple or straightforward. And the first point I'll make is a really simple one. Immigrants, and I can speak to this from personal experience, we age too. And this graph kind of just makes that point really simply. Yes, recent immigrants are a very young group relative to the rest of the country, but more established immigrants have older profiles, as we would expect for those who've been in the country for as long as 10 to as many as 40 years. Immigrants in Canada, as well as most OECD countries, also tend to have fertility rates similar to the population they are immigrating to, which in most OECD countries is quite low. So what does this mean? It means that while immigration is a critical policy lever to mitigate workforce aging, it is not going to solve everything. There are other factors that we need to consider too. Immigrants are more likely to settle in big cities and big provinces, meaning the benefits won't be felt everywhere if there isn't an intentional strategy. Immigrants are also more likely to be focused in some sectors than others. And as I alluded to earlier about immigrants coming from countries with higher fertility rates, most studies have found that immigrants tend to have fertility rates closer to the countries they move to, not the countries they move from. And this is especially apparent through successive generations of immigrants. Again, very complex socioeconomic factors are involved here. And of course, as we know, immigration has sharply decreased in recent years. So we should expect its impact on the aging population to be reduced. Immigration, like many things these days, is subject to economic, cultural, and political forces. And we cannot assume that the policies of today or yesterday will reflect the policies of tomorrow. So you might be wondering, well, what else or who else can we rely on? Well, over the past 75 years, one could argue nothing has had a bigger impact on the demographics of the Canadian workforce than the increased participation of women. Women have had an instrumental role in Canada's economic growth, as you can clearly see in this chart, showing you the percentage of women in the workforce compared to men over the past 60 years. This has helped to increase the amount of available labor in Canada. Now, there are some very big things to consider here. First, this would not have been possible without the introduction of policies like maternity leave and equitable policies to support women in the workplace, which made it easier for women to enter the workforce. We also know that that work is far from done. For example, there are many unique challenges that women face in the workplace, from cultural, social, safety, and fairness perspectives. This can sometimes manifest in lopsided representation of either men or women in certain occupations. And that can actually prevent the benefits of women in the workforce if they aren't represented in at-risk occupations. We know, however, that there are many efforts being made, especially in the trades, to try to help to address this. Okay, we've gone through a lot of stats, a lot of forces, some of which may seem somewhat dire, but as I said earlier, the future is not set in stone. We can mitigate and we can prepare. So, what can we do? Well, the first thing is to acknowledge reality. This is an almost universal challenge across advanced economies that has deep-rooted, complex, and competing factors far beyond the scope of this talk. Take a look at this figure in front of you right here. What you're looking at is the median age of OECD countries with age on the y-axis. You can see that Canada is actually somewhere in the middle, if not slightly on the younger side of countries that have an aging population. I mention this because it's important to realize while this is quite common, we are still in a better position than many other advanced economies, so we should take advantage of this to plan strategically. If you forgot this was an LMIC presentation, the second thing is that we need to do is to leverage labor market information and data to identify occupations and regions at risk. By doing so, we can make targeted, efficient, and evidence-based decisions. This is what we will need to do if we want to make evidence-driven and strategic workforce planning. We can't just guess our way through a global demographic phenomenon. We need to make evidence-based decisions. Evidence-based decision-making can also inform the next thing we do. As the population ages and the workforce continues to be affected by things like automation, AI, climate change, and altered consumer habits, lifelong learning will become more important. So we need to think about what the future of education, training, and reskilling might look like for millions of Canadians that may need to adjust. Whether that's more flexible programs, integrating universal design for learning, more competency-based education, more part-time programs, more incentives for on-the-job training, or micro-credentials, there are many options for how we can think about what lifelong learning needs to look like and the information and data that we share with each other into the public to understand their options. All of this will need to be guided by strong quality frameworks and robust evaluation tied to labor market data so that we can understand labor market outcomes. I know what I am describing is a lot of work, but it's what we'll need to do if we want to identify the best path forward. Secondly, everyone, and I mean everyone, needs to work together to break down silos, political, cultural, administrative, data, to identify the behavioral reasons why young people are choosing some pathways and avoiding others. This includes trying to understand the labor market information we're sharing with young people that may be influencing their pathways. This involves a lot of people and at earlier stages in Canadians' lives than you might expect. When I was in education, we often said that access and pathways begin in kindergarten. Some would argue earlier. And I think there's a lot of truth to this statement. Students and their parents have an immense role in the pathways that students pursue, as do their teachers, counselors, and the information shared by government and institutions during formative career exploration years. But trade unions, polytechnics, colleges, and universities also have a role to play in how they are advertising, sharing labor market information, and paths to prosperity that can encourage young people to think about their future differently. This is especially pertinent for the skilled trades, where cultural biases, real and perceived equity challenges, and confusion about economic opportunity might be hindering entry into the skilled trades. Industry and employers need to be involved too, because as I said earlier, we expect consumer habits to shift to our changing demographics. We currently expect that to mean a greater need for healthcare workers. Think social workers, PSWs, in-house healthcare, nurses, etc. Policymakers and those who study education and occupational pathways also need to be involved, as it's not just going to be a matter of simply getting more youth into healthcare and the skilled trades, especially if after they complete their education, they leave the occupation because of burnout or cultural barriers. All of that will mean we just end up in the same situation. So, this is another space where industry and employers are going to be really important. In a nutshell, we need to look at pathways into occupations, but we also do need to think about how do we keep people satisfied and content in critical occupations. And we also need, again, LMIC, we need labor market information and data to be able to see if that's happening. So that brings me to my next point. Training systems like apprenticeships have a lot of stakeholders who face distinct and unique challenges that can be a barrier to scaling up some of this youth recruitment effort I'm talking about. Remember, an apprenticeship often requires uptake from an employer or a union in order to complete one's apprenticeship. But in tough economic times, like the one that we are living in right now, that is much easier said than done. So we need to think about the incentives we're providing to stakeholders to make sure they have the ability to provide this training in the first place. Because of the fiscal reality many are facing in government and the private sector, it will be most efficient to use an evidence-based approach to identify specific occupations and regions to invest in and provide strategic funding. Evaluating these practices to determine their effectiveness can also allow an iterative approach to improve how we approach the problem. Key to all of this, and I know I'm saying this a lot, will be really good data and labor market information to keep tuning the things that we do. This contrasts, of course, to a one-size-fits-all approach, which will be more expensive and potentially less feasible given the current fiscal environment that I know many of us are living in. Now, finally, we can expect Canadians to know what they don't know, especially if they already maybe don't see themselves in certain occupations. It's not a secret that there are many equity issues in parts of our education and training systems, and that this can be highly variable from program to program. And this includes for mature workers as well. This is why using data effectively to identify equity imbalances or challenges can help our long-term strategic planning. Remember what I shared earlier, that women entering the workforce has helped to mitigate the aging population. This remains more significant and acute in some occupations than others. In an almost ironic fashion, the equity imbalances in some occupations present opportunity for addressing at-risk occupations. But that again, much easier said than done, and I know that. But there is tremendous effort across Canada to address cultural, social, and economic barriers to occupations, especially in the skilled trades. These efforts are going to be very important if we're serious about meaningfully addressing these challenges. Now, before I conclude, I am acutely aware of how much work this will all take. Collecting data, analyzing labor market information, and doing interpretation of data, it can be difficult and a lot of work. But one of the things that I hope you take away from this is that these big demographic forces we're talking about, they're happening whether we like it or not. So we need to be proactive to support all Canadians as best as we can. And like pretty much every recommendation I've shared, they'll all require all hands on deck to address. So with that call to action, let's have some reflection and discussion. And I'm excited to see and hear your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken, for the presentation so far. Lots of information to absorb, and we do have some questions from our attendees. Of course, if you're still interested in entering any questions, you can do so in the chat or in the Q&A section at the bottom, so that we can go through them. So, Ken, our first question that we have is It seems to be a paradox between significant risk of labor shortages due to retirements and a record high of youth unemployment we have seen. Is it true we're in a labor shortage?
So I think that paradox, and whoever asked that question, it's a really good question because it's very true. We're having certain occupations, especially within the trades, where you have the older workforce retiring and there's lots of vacancies, but we have really high youth employment at the same time. So how is that possible? Really, what we're talking about is a mismatch between the flows of labor into occupations and the flow of labor out of occupations. And that mismatch is creating this kind of strange dichotomy where we have really high youth and unemployment, and we have really high vacancies for certain occupations. And this is where something like strategic planning can come in really handy. I will say LMIC has been doing a lot of work on this area recently. We'll be doing a talk next month about youth unemployment. We will also be publishing some work on that as well because we know it's a very pertinent and urgent challenge for people right now. But that paradox is very much a real thing.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And then for anyone who hasn't signed up for LMIC's newsletter, we will send a link to do that after this webinar as well. On to the next question. And this is one about the replacement ratio. So what's the ideal replacement ratio comparatively, whether it is low or high?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think, today we really focused on the age replacement ratio not as something that we need to strive to, but rather something that can send us a signal about risk. I think when you're looking at flows of labor and whether an occupation is balanced or not, there's a whole suite of factors that I would look at, including unemployment, vacancy rate, unemployment to vacancy ratio. We're actually working on producing a whole guide just about labor market imbalances to help people figure out how to judge whether or not there's an imbalance in their sector for their specific situation. So that's something that we're hoping that we're going to aim to come out in the next 6 months or so. But I think for the purposes of this particular report that Ian and Laura did, they landed on 3.6 as the national average. I think it really was about trying to find the signal and determine whether or not this is something we need to look into from a policy perspective.
That's a great point to make. Thank you for sharing that. The next question, a little bit more broad, but how can you remain relevant in this very fast-paced season of change in the workplace?
Oh, that's like a really tough question because things are changing so fast. I think it's a combination of things, and I often think of this as a bit of a two-way street. One, yes, employees and workers have to keep themselves afoot of what's going on in terms of skills and things they need to do in order to be successful in the labor market. But employers also have a role to play in articulating these needs very clearly as well, whether it's training within certain occupations or doing things like micro training or micro credentials or getting exposure through work. I think those are some of the ways that we can address that. I do think this question of upskilling is a really big question that people are trying to figure out right now in multiple ways in Canada right now. I think there's lots of folks who are working on developing quality frameworks to help people better understand what type of training is right for you that will give you the outcome you're looking for. But I do think it will be more of that lifelong learning approach.
Yeah, and I think this kind of plays into the next question too. So, a little bit more specific to the role of career counselors and how
Mhm.
they play into the reskilling of an aging workforce that might not really be ready to retire or for whatever reasons might still want to be staying at work. So, is there any tools that you want to recommend on reskilling? Because it really does feel like a buzzword these days, is what the attendee is mentioning.
Yes. I saw this question and I really liked it. I'll speak first to just sort of the personal side of it. I'm someone who, a very different situation, but I switched careers about 10 years ago, and I had a CDP that I saw like at least once a week for a very long time. And what that did for me I'm thinking about someone who may be having to switch careers, especially if they're later in their career and they're like, I have to learn entirely new skills. It's kind of a scary thing. And I think the thing that a lot of people say about CDPs, either through experience or what they're hoping for, is I think CDPs can help people build resiliency, confidence, but also a set of expectations about what to expect. I remember learning that it takes on average 16 to 24 weeks to find a job was very helpful for me because it put a lot of pressure off of myself and it helped me set realistic expectations. So I think setting expectations is really important. Some of the research I've done in the past with school to work have shown that that can be something that influences decision making. I think leveraging the increase in labor market tools and labor market dashboards can help guide people towards the specific needs they have. For example, if someone's just looking for a part-time job and they just want to make X amount of money, leveraging LMI well can help you find something for that person versus someone who's maybe looking for something a bit more vocational and more of a calling, which I think is different. So I do think this is a space that I personally found CDPs really important, was just that system of support and helping people go through those expectations when, it can be 6 weeks or more until you get like a response back from sending out resumes.
Yeah, I appreciate that the contextual piece and the personal anecdote that you shared here. And then kind of to that point, the resources that can be sought. A question that's kind of relevant to this too. I believe Gabrielle is responding as well, but where can people find information on LMI reports for the results of all your works?
Oh,
And
yeah.
then, yeah,
So you can find everything on LMIC's website in terms of our research. I will say we're working on producing and developing a whole new suite of labor market information dashboards over the next year or so, because we're hearing about the kind of information that people want, what would be useful. So do subscribe to our newsletter because there's going to be a lot of new things, tools, and visualizations that will help you get a better understanding of what's going on in the labor market. I would just say in terms of actual data, in terms of robustness, like you really can't get better than Statistics Canada. There's a great LFS visualization dashboard that StatsGain has that you can check out if you want to learn about some of this stuff. Um, there are also private providers of data such as Vicinity Jobs and Lightcast, which can give you a very direct sense of employer demand for skills and jobs at a very high frequency that can be quite useful depending on the context of who you're helping.
thanks, Ken. Such a great wealth of knowledge that you have, and I know people are going to be asking, what's the website? What is it exactly that you mentioned?" So the recording will be up in the coming days. You'll be able to access that, and we'll also put a list of all of the resources that Ken mentioned in the follow-up email. So thank you for sharing that. A next question is, while some older workers are retiring, many others are choosing or have no choice but to continue working. How does this increase of older workers affect the need for workplace accessibility? How do these needs differ from those younger workers who may experience disability? And how can employers support older workers, including those who experience disability?
This is a really great question. I love this question. I've published work in the space of disability before, so it's something I'm very passionate about. But it's just an interesting question in general. It's a conversation I just have with my parents from time to time as they're approaching retirement and they're thinking about, am I going to be able to afford to be, no longer working? And do I even want that? What does that look like? But I'm going to speak to this from the employer perspective because I think the employer perspective matters a lot. And in terms of what things that I've either done in previous research or things that could be useful, employee surveys are one way to do it. I think it's always very healthy to do an employee survey, especially if it's around needs and accessibility and you're noticing that your workforce is changing. The best way to know how to support your workforce is to just ask them directly. And an employee survey is one way to do that. Very simple, very basic. I am a proponent of universal design for learning, which can also be applied to universal design in work as well, which is basically to design spaces and processes that are built in mind for everyone of all types of ability. So instead of, say, there will always be a need for specific accommodations, but there is a world where we can build workspaces and cultures and processes that consider the different ways that people learn and work. Universal design is something that I always recommend people look into if they're trying to figure out how to make a more inclusive workspace. And it's something that I find really fascinating and interesting. But the other thing that I'll say to get a little more specific here, in research that I've done around the barriers that students, and a lot of my previous work was on, new graduates, but I think it applies to really everyone, especially in the context of disability. People with disabilities often tend to have a much higher rate of saying they had challenges at the very, very beginning of a job recruitment process. From the moment they open the job posting, there are ways that we can all make things easier for people with disabilities or who have an accessibility issue. State your accommodation practices in the job posting. I've heard even through interviews that this is something that lets people, it signals to people, this is a workspace that will provide accommodation to you. This is a workspace that will support you. People say when they don't see that, it leaves them wondering, well, is this job going to accommodate me? And then when you're making the decision to apply to a job, when you have dozens of jobs to choose to apply to you, it matters when it's clear that this is a workspace that's going to provide accommodations. It also matters in the interview process as well. Think about, is the way that you're conducting, or the way that you're conducting interviews accessible and mindful for people who are perhaps neurodiverse, or for people who may be especially anxious during an interview, but otherwise would not feel super anxious. So the recruitment process is a big part of it. The onboarding, we have heard, is a really big part of it. It's not uncommon for people to only realize they have services a couple of years into a job, and maybe we're suffering in silence or didn't bother to ask. Be really clear and upfront with your staff when you hire them about everything that's available to them. These things have been shown to matter for people because even if something is written down, it matters when your boss says to you, hey, you have these services and I want you to use them if you need it. Because it's not just about it being on paper, it's also about the cultural aspect as well. So those are some of the things that have come through in previous research that I've done around supporting people with disabilities in the workplace.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Ken. We can see that there's a lot of passion in the response that you have here. So great that we can have that information right up front in this question and answer period.
And
Um,
there's so much more, by the way. I'm just, yeah, but those are some good places to start.
Fantastic. A question from Nicole. Are the typical physical needs to complete average tasks in particular occupations like the trades or healthcare aides taken into consideration when determining replacement ratios, or is age the main factor?
So is this the age that people are entering a training program? Let me take a look at the question. I think I see. I think that's a really interesting question. And I'll be honest, I don't think I have a clear answer to that. I think one of the things I hope people take away from this presentation is that this is a place to start. The age replacement ratio gives you a place to start asking questions. Because I think, the type of work you're doing within, say, a trade occupation versus, say, an office job is quite different. So we would expect physical needs to perhaps take a greater precedent there than it might in other occupations. I think this is where qualitative research would be really useful to understand some of the nuances within specific occupations and how this might be factoring in. In the study that we did, it was not factored in.
Thanks, Ken. Um, we have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to go through maybe three more questions. We have a question from Samantha. As a career advisor, I find that older workers are having more difficulty finding work in the labor market.
Hmm.
Any thoughts on how we can combat this considering our workforce is aging?
Yeah, that is a really difficult question. I imagine a very frustrating experience for people. And I think there's a couple of things I'm thinking about. The first is what I said earlier about the recruitment process. If you don't see yourself in a job when you're reading the job posting. I didn't know about everyone else on this call, but I don't apply. I go on the website of a company, I look at the people who work there, I do my LinkedIn snooping as we all do. I often try to do an informational interview, and if I don't feel like there is a cultural match, like I'm not going to apply and I'm not going to feel comfortable doing that. And so I wonder how much of it is, when I talked about universal design, accessibility, and job postings, is that part of the issue? I don't know the answer to that. I think that as the population ages, I do think that this is a more pertinent question that we'll have to really investigate. Again, I think this is a space where qualitative research will be really useful. I'd love to hear from a cohort of older workers who are struggling to find work, but also employers. Like, I wonder, what are employer perspectives on this? Is it a matter of how resumes are written, which seems a bit mundane, but the cultural differences in the way we write resumes and cover letters, even from 20 years ago, I remember, is somewhat different. The way that resumes and cover letters are scanned is very different than it was 20 years ago. So unfortunately, I wish I had a better answer for that, but I think uh, I would like to see some qualitative research with some interviews and perhaps surveys done there. But the other answer I'll give is one thing we can do is, and again, I say this as someone who switched careers and it was very challenging and confusing. Seek the support where you have it. I always tell young people, do informational interviews, talk to the people in the careers you want to do, and figure out if you're showing the skills that you need to get a call back. I would not have figured out how to switch to policy from biomedical engineering if I didn't do that. I talked to as many people as I could. I asked them to review my resume. It could be something as simple as that. But again, I don't have any evidence-driven answers beside my own personal experiences there.
All very fair points. I think I'll go into one more question. This one is a little bit more specific. What are the
Mhm.
effective strategies to change the mindset of an aging workforce who were in the industry maybe for 30 or more years and now might want to or need to change industry or learn a new industry, or any other personal circumstances? So, how do you think we can remotivate them to start again and build resiliency?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that is a really interesting and fascinating question. I mean, again, I'm thinking about like, if I'm having this conversation with my parents, part of it is like, I want you guys to retire and enjoy the rest of your life. But I also know some people are just like, no, I don't want to, I want to always be doing something, right? Sorry, that could be a funny tagline, always be doing something. But I think it's a bit of a two-way street, right? And I know I keep coming back to this, but if opportunities don't meet people where they're at, how can they work there if they don't even want to? I mean, that sounds like a pretty, doesn't sound like a good bargain for anybody, right? And so I will go back to thinking about the way that we work. I mean, you look at the past 20 years and how workplaces have completely evolved to meet the needs of, millennials and Gen Z. In a similar way, I do think there will be an evolution towards the fact that we're going to have lots of young people and mature workers working together. What does that look like in terms of even something as simple as physical spaces or the ways that we engage with each other? I do think this is something that will come as much from employers and the cultural approach that we set to that. Um, but in terms of building resiliency, I know, again, it's not just because there's a lot of CDPs in this audience that I'm saying this, but like, I really do think having and seeking support is so important for building resiliency. There's a lot of things we can do on their own, but it's often better when you have someone to get you through those difficult times and show you that either A, this is just part of the process, or to just, allow you to just be, annoyed for a couple of weeks while you're in the process. Um, yeah, I think that it comes from both directions, I think.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ken. I think I'm going to wrap up our question and answer period as we have just one more minute. So I'm going to wrap up here. Of course, I want to say thank you. A huge thank you for presenting with us to LMIC for sponsoring this webinar series. And to all of you in the audience who have joined us for all these great conversations, engaging with fantastic questions, showing up and showing interest in the webinar series, and in the slides and all the questions and answers. So, of course, we will be sending the slides and the recording out in the coming days. So please look out for that. We'll share all the resources possible. And of course, before you actually leave, we want to hear your feedback, please. So take a couple of minutes, please, to share your learnings and all your learning needs and put your insights into our survey at the end of our session. As well as in the coming days, or coming weeks, we're going to have a couple of things for you to explore at CEREC. So we want to share those with you. So first of all, we have the fall webinar series that has just launched. We're wrapping up this webinar series, but we also have two more series coming up. The first one is the Ultimate Recruitment Series. This might look familiar to you. We did present this in English earlier in spring and winter, and we are presenting it now in French. So if you are interested in learning about recruitment, or you have Francophone colleagues who are interested in learning about recruitment and the latest trends, feel free to register for that. That's happening in November. We also are going to be joined by Harky Cutler for a webinar on breaking the cycle and increasing your client's self-sufficiency so that you can empower your clients rather than enable them. So that's a great one that's happening in the middle of November and continuing on. And of course, we are continuing with our cohorts of our 6-week certificate program with CASE. It's an intersectional approach to supporting career development. This is a great certificate program for you to go in depth in supporting different kinds of audiences intersectionally and with different diversity needs. So that last cohort is happening beginning November 3rd. So you might want to register for that as soon as possible. A couple of final opportunities that we want to notify you of. Our program is now available for Connexus 26. So I know a lot of people are looking forward to this. We have over 140 sessions that we are featuring in this 20th anniversary edition of Connexus that we won't want to miss. We do still have really great rates available as well, with the early bird rate ending on November 7th. So make sure to register for those rates. And if you are a member of any supporting organizations, you also get an additional discount. So lots to look forward to there. And of course, we are wrapping up our call for the Etta St. John Wildman Award. Um, this is wrapping up next week. So if you want to nominate an individual who's doing excellent work in the field, please submit those nominations by next week on Monday. And you can check out cerec.ca/Wildman to award to do so. And that wraps us up for our webinar. So, of course, again, a warm thank you to our sponsor, the Labor Market Information Council. This has been an incredible series. It's been fantastic to work with them. And it's such a pleasure to see the LMIC team. They're also going to be at our conference at Connexus. So, another reason for you to be joining us there, either in person or virtually. Again, thank you for joining us throughout the series and for all of your engagement. We're hoping to see you again later on in the season for more exciting learning initiatives. And I would like to officially close the webinar. So thank you in advance for taking the time to share your thoughts in our survey. And we hope to see you again soon. And have a great rest of your day.